In the winter of 1998, a dying man, I'll call Edward Corliss, asked the 6 people at his bedside to do one thing after he was gone: not to pray, not to forgive him, not to bury him a certain way. He asked them to keep a schedule, the one he had kept, without missing once, for 40 years. Here is what the schedule was, because there is no point being coy. On the lowest tide of every month, he walked out onto the exposed seafloor off a rock in Maine, carrying a covered pail, and left what was in it on a stone for something that came up out of the water to take it. He called it feeding them. He never said clearly what they were. He was very clear about what happened if the feeding stopped. And when he finished explaining it all, what he left, who he left it for, what he believed, he was buying the room emptied. One by one, the people who loved him found reasons to step into the hall, until only the hospice nurse was left, because it was her job to stay. Let's start with what can be established. Corliss, not his name, but it will do, spent nearly his whole adult life on a low finger of granite I'll call Sable Neck, some miles down the shore road from a harbor town I'll call Harnet's Landing. It is not a place people go, a quarter-mile of exposed rock and salt grass that floods to an island at the highest tides. At its seaward end sits a small automated light and the shell of a fog signal station that was manned into the early 1960s, when the service automated the light and pulled its last people out. Corliss stayed on as a private caretaker after the government left, paid a small stipend by an arrangement no one at the town office could ever quite explain to me. He read the tide the way other men read the newspaper. And everything strange in this story runs back to the tide. So, hold on to it. The habit itself was no secret. A retired school teacher I'll call Alice Pruitt, who spent her last decade collecting coastal accounts and interviewed 2 people from that hospice room, established that the neighbors had known for decades that Corliss walked to the low water line on the lowest tide of every month, in every weather, with a covered pail. They assumed it was bait traps, eels, one of the 100 private things men who live alone on the water do. Nobody asked. On a coast like that, you do not ask a man what is in his pail. But Pruitt found one detail from those years I could not make sit still. On the mornings after his walk, Corliss's boots were set outside the door, upside down, drying ordinary enough. What was not ordinary is what the neighbor who noticed, a lobsterman who ran past before dawn, insisted on. The boots were never wet on the outside, they were wet on the inside. As if the water had come up through them, as if he had stood in something that rose, not splashed. And here's the part that turns it strange. It was not food. Feeding was the word Corliss used, the word that made it into the story. But he called it the closest word, not the right one. What was in the pail was not meat, not fish, not bread. It was warmth. He filled the pail each month from the station's old cistern. Water, he did something to the transcription. Breaks exactly here. One of Pruitt's dashes that came out warmer than it should have been, and heavy in a way water is not. What took it from the stone did not eat it. It drew the warmth out. He would come back the next low tide to find the water still on the stone, cold now, clear, ordinary, and pour it back into the sea. Corliss was asked once, by Absalom, in that first year, what they looked like, and his answer is the whole case in 9 words. He said, "You'll see them fine. It's the seeing them that's wrong." That sentence has kept me up more nights than I want to admit. You'll see them fine, not hidden, not blurred, not a trick of fog and tired eyes. It's the seeing them that's wrong. The failure is not in the image but in the act, not in how they appear but in what happens in you when you look, as if the thing were looking back out of something that is not its eyes. Corliss did not elaborate. Absalom did not push. And Pruitt, decades later, drew her dash and moved on, and the gap sits where the answer should be. What followed, across 40 years, was a routine. The pail, the stone, the walk back before the turn. He did it the month his wife died, went down the same night in his funeral clothes, then sat with the body until morning. He did it in the storm of 1978 that took the roof off the station. He did it sick, once with a broken hand, and once so old and slow he nearly did not make it back before the water turned lying in the rack with the sea coming up around his boots. Understanding that the turn does not wait, and getting up anyway. Why? That is the question the whole thing keeps asking and never answers. But 3 things in the account are harder to set aside than the rest. First, the ledger Absalom's, which Corliss kept and added to, which the family found after his death, and which, of course, has since been lost. But Pruitt saw it, a tidekeeper's log going back past 1958 in one hand, and past that in a hand, older still, page after page, each month a single line, a tide height, a note of what was left and what was found in the flat rhythm of men doing a job. No drama, no wonder. Just the entries, monthly, across more years than one man could account for, the handwriting changing hands down the decades. Second, the line the high water mark. More than one person who had walked the neck told Pruitt the same thing unprompted. Dogs would not go below it. You could walk a dog the length of Sable Neck, and it would trot happily above the rack line, and at the high water mark it would stop, and no coaxing took it lower. It would stand with its nose toward the flat and the stone, not barking, only watching. Corliss's own dog, in his last years, walked him down to that line and no further, and waited there until he came back up. Third, the sleep. After the monthly walk, Corliss slept, and it was not ordinary sleep. Pruitt found a doctor who remembered being puzzled by what the old man reported, that one night a month he went under so deep nothing reached him until the tide turned, and woke with no memory of the hours, only a tiredness that took the day to lift, and the sense that during them he had been used for something. The doctor had written it up as a curiosity and forgotten it, except that when I went to find the file, it was not there, not misplaced. The practice had closed decades ago, and a clerk told me, with the flat serenity of people who guard old paper, that records from that era are not routinely kept. Not routinely kept. It sounds less like an accident than a policy. The men came once. In the spring of 1971, according to the transcription and one account Pruitt collected, a boat came out to the neck that was not a fishing boat. 2 men, not in uniform, not from the harbor. They did not come up to talk. They went onto the flat at low water and took soundings around the stone, measured it, Corliss said, the way you measure a thing you already know is there and left. And after that, the stipend began arriving more regularly, and twice a year a delivery came. Not food, not supplies, but a sealed drum for the cistern, left on the town dock addressed to him, sender unstated. Someone was resupplying the keeper of Sable Neck. Corliss did not know who, and had stopped asking, the same way he had stopped asking what he was looking at on the stone. The neighbors who watched that boat come and go said nothing, not then and not for years after. On that coast, the silence around the neck was total, and the silence was, in its own way, the loudest thing in the record. Now I have to make the case against all of it, because it is a strong one, and the whole thing is worthless if I flinch from it. 1. A man lived alone on a rock for 40 years, and isolation that deep does things to a person. The walk could have begun as a chore and hardened, over decades of solitude, into a private religion he could no longer see around. 2 is worse, because it explains the transmission. A dying old man calls a younger one to his bedside and hands him an unshakable monthly compulsion and a story about why it must never stop. That is not evidence of something real passing between them. It is almost exactly the anatomy of how a superstition is handed down, from a frightened old mind to a suggestible young one, at a deathbed, the one moment nobody argues. The chain of keepers is not proof the thing is real. It may only be proof the fear is contagious. 3. The strangest physical detail, the boots, comes secondhand a lobsterman who ran past before dawn and glanced at boots outside a door. Distance, bad light, one man's memory decades later. That is not an observation. It is an anecdote about one. And 4. Dogs refuse ground for reasons that have nothing to do with the uncanny. A smell, a wind off the flat, salt that stings their feet. We read meaning into an animal stopping. The animal may only be smelling low tide. And 5. The one that should bother you most. The record I am building this on was written by hand, from a tape, by a woman who already believed there was a pattern before she pressed play. Pruitt did not come to the neck neutral. She came collecting exactly this kind of story, and transcribed a dying man's broken, half-inaudible words into the shape she was already looking for. Every dash where the audio failed is a place her expectation got to fill. The pail is still here. When Corliss died, it was left on the neck, and Pruitt took it, and when she died, it passed to the relative who inherited her papers, and that person, who wants nothing to do with any of this, let me hold it. An ordinary galvanized pail, dented, 60-odd years old, except for the inside. Up to a line about a third of the way from the bottom, exactly where a month's water would sit, it is not rusted and not corroded. It is scaled with a fine pale crust laid down in rings, like the inside of a kettle, except that no kettle grows this, and no chemist I have asked will name it. And sable neck was not the only one. I want to be careful here, because the moment you connect points across a map, you can talk yourself into a pattern that is only the map's emptiness taking form. But the one that stays with me is not on the ocean at all. A woman who grew up at a remote light on the Great Lakes told a historian in the 1990s that her father had paid the low water every month for as long as she could remember and made her swear, before he died, to keep paying it. She came apart on the tape, describing the one winter the ice came early and sealed the stone under a foot of Black Lake ice, and how her father, an old man by then, went down onto that ice with an axe and the pail and chopped through to the stone in the dark, because the appointment does not care that the water has frozen over it. She stood at the top of the bank with a lantern, listening to him chop, and did not go down. One keeper is a lonely eccentric, feeding his own private ghost. 2, on different waters, keeping the same monthly appointment at the same kind of low-water stone, each with the same hole where the paperwork should be, starts to look less like folklore than administration. Something older than the keepers, running quietly along the edges of the inhabited water, treating each man not as a believer and not as a victim, but as a post that has to be staffed, and treating whatever comes up on the lowest tide not as a monster to be fought, but as a party to an agreement that has to be kept. And that is the reframing the whole thing turns on, and it is the darkest part. Corliss did not think he was watching the coast, he said so plainly, in the one stretch of transcription that runs clean for more than a sentence. He was not a sentry holding a line against an invasion. He was keeping a bargain. The monthly warmth on the stone was not bait and not defense. It was payment. And what it bought, every month for 40 years, was that they stayed below the high water mark. His word for his own job, the word Pruitt underlined twice, was not guard. It was tribute. Near the end of the transcription, the nurse's account and Pruitt's converge on the same exchange, and it is the closest the record comes to a floor under all of it. One of the 6, a grandnephew, by most accounts, asked what happens if the walk just stops, if nobody goes down, and Corliss, who had been drifting, came back completely lucid. He said, "Then the line moves, not fast." Absalom had told him that the last time the appointment lapsed, it was a very bad year up and down the coast, and by the time the keeping resumed, the high water mark was not where it had been, and had to be walked back down, month by month, at a cost he would not describe. And then Corliss looked around at the 6 faces and said the sentence that emptied the room. He said, "One of you is going to have to keep this up." That is when they began, one by one, to find the hallway. Here is the detail I was left with, and it is the reason I could not put the story down. Corliss died in January of 1998, 3 days after the room emptied. The lowest tide of that month fell 4 nights later. Pruitt drove out to a rise above the shore on that tide and watched the flat come out of the water in the last light. And she wrote, in the last full entry before the dashes take over, that the stone was uncovered, as it always was on the deep pull, and that it was not bare. Something pale had already been left on it, catching the last light for a moment before the dark came down over the neck. And from the rise, she could see a single set of boot prints going down the flat toward the stone and coming back stopping, both ways, exactly at the high water line, where the dogs stop, where the prints had begun. She did not go down to look. She understood, sitting there, that the walk had been kept that 4 nights after the only man who admitted to keeping it was in the ground. The appointment had been met, on time, by someone she did not want to be seen knowing, on a coast where the silence had held for 40 years and meant to go on holding. So, the ledger is still open. Somewhere on a rock in Maine, on the lowest tide of this month, a pail is carried down and set on a stone and carried back, before the turn, by hands that inherited the keeping the way Corliss did from a mouth at a deathbed. What is in the pail is not food. What takes the warmth from it is not hungry, only owed. And the line holds where it holds because every month, in every weather, someone still walks down to the water and pays. He kept the bargain for 40 years. Then he died, and the room emptied, and the tide came in, and the tide went out, and the walk was kept anyway.